Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. I am Brandon Laws. I'm the Director of Marketing at Xenium HR. And we recently had the opportunity to partner with Atainium and Steve Brook on a very business-focused topic. And we decided to do something on effective project management. It's a very important topic, and there's a great response for this. So wanted to just put this out there. If you want more topics like this, make sure to follow up with us in the chat window, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But uh, very excited to have Steve Brook here. He is the president and founder of Atainium. Steve is an accomplished leader with 25 years of diverse consulting and executive experience. Steve builds and guides organizations to achieve ambitious goals. Steve is a natural enabler, always working to improve the capabilities of the organization, and skilled at integrating people, processes, and technology to deliver tangible results. Steve is also passionate about making organizations more effective so they focus on doing the right things in the best possible way. Steve has worked with business leaders and executives of organizations such as Nike, Kroger, Albertsons, Nautilus, US Bank, Salem Health, and Pfizer. Steve is a certified PMP and adjunct professor teaching project management at Portland State University. So we're really excited to have Steve with us. And as I mentioned, I'm Brandon Laws, the Director of Marketing at Xenium HR. I'll be your moderator. And I want to go over some housekeeping items before I turn it over to Steve. He's got a great presentation, and he needs every minute of this hour, so I'll move along fast. We're going to plan for about 45 minutes of this presentation. We may cut into that a little bit, but we'll try to leave 15 minutes of Q&A. But I do want you to, as things come into your mind about this presentation, if you have a question for Steve throughout it, I will be monitoring those. So make sure to open up that chat window and type whatever question comes to mind. Or if you want to drill down further on a specific topic, let us know that too, because Steve could extrapolate this really far, and he could probably follow up with more detail about this with you. The slides and recording will be available to all attendees. So probably about 24 hours after this, maybe 2 days, we'll send out the slides and recordings so you can review it and share with your teams. And to get alerts about new events that Xenium's putting on, including webinars, live events, workshops, and other content like our podcasts and blog posts, you can subscribe at xeniumhr.com. And of course, you can learn more about Steve Brook, who is our presenter at Atainium, www.atainium.com. And without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn it over to Steve right now. Welcome, Steve.
All right, thanks, Brandon. Thanks for the intro. Welcome, everybody. I hope you have a full cup of coffee, glass of water, and are ready. As Brandon mentioned, there's a lot of information we'll be going through in the next 45 minutes. So I will walk through the slides as diligently as I can. And if you have questions, send those, post those on the chat board. And if you want more detail on things, I certainly could arrange time to chat in greater depth, offline if you want to at some point as well. So what we're going to cover today is basically the core components of the planning process for planning a project, kind of the middle of the activity. I'll go through a little bit of an overview of the project management process, and then the specific steps of really planning the scope, schedule, and resources of those steps of getting that put together. At the end of this webinar, I think if you can take away, a trick, a technique, something that I cover, that would be excellent. To kind of absorb it all from zero is probably a big lift, but I'd expect after the workshop today that you'd have a better understanding of really how to break down project work into its kind of manageable pieces, how to really understand and evaluate that relationship between activities, and then using those relationships to really build an informed schedule, and lastly apply resources to that plan. So those are the things we're going to roll through. We'll start kind of with an overview, looking at the project world from a distance a little bit, And this is a kind of example. I've tried to take the really academic project words out of this and put this in a little bit of plain language for everybody. The project, a complete project framework, a complete project process starts with really getting things started, understanding what the project is and how you're going to go about it and why you would do it, to then the process of planning the work, which we're going to spend this 45 minutes on. Once this plan is done, then it would really kind of get the work done and then close it out, okay? And what I put in here was particular activities, tools that you do in each section, kind of the purpose of each section, who would roughly do this, how much time on a project you would allocate to this particular phase of the project, and then lastly at the bottom, what's the value really of of this particular phase of project work. So this is a good slide here just to kind of keep the whole picture in place for you of where we're at any particular time in the project planning process. So if I take that and distill it down to what we're going to cover today, the first part, getting started, really addresses the why. Why am I going to do this project? Why is the organization want to have it done? And we're going to presume for today that that work has been done, that you have a project charter in place, or somebody's asked you to do something specifically. And what we have to do with the planning process is really drill down on what needs to be done, or the scope in this case, when you're going to do it, which is the schedule, and then who's going to do the work, which is the resources. And then it gets hand off to really, when you're working the plan, how are people doing things, what's their status, so on and so forth, to finally project success at the end, if everything goes well and it's managed accordingly. All right. So as we start out, this might be a slide or a piece of information that you may have seen before. The reason I bring this up is this is really the, in the terms of physics or anything, this is really, kind of the Newtonian physics or the gravity of a project management itself. It's the non-negotiables, scope, schedule, budget. When you're managing a project at any time along the way, you have to be able to at least move or manage at least one of these three items. They all can't be fixed. Generally on a project, one of them tends to be fixed. And in the case of the budget for our conversation today, we're really addressing that in terms of the resources available. So keep this in mind. The environment that I have outlined on the outside of this is really the environment with which the scope, schedule, and budget are executed inside of. So it could be, and you look at the governance politics, how decisions are made, who makes them, the culture. Is it a new startup? Is it a government? Is it a nonprofit? Is it high tech? And then the industry, what industry you're in. Those things all affect how this operates. They don't change the relationship between the triangle. So now we'll move right into planning. And I like to say, a goal or a vision or an objective without a plan is just a wish or a dream, right? And then, when folks go, I hope this is going to happen, a hope is not a course of action. It's not a plan. So we're going to walk through the steps to actually turn these things into real, tangible results. So an overview of the planning process. Really, the main purpose, the primary purpose of really good, effective project planning is to make sure that your work has a guide to it, that people understand where they need to be, what needs to be done, and when it's going to happen. The project planning process really is the process of going through and breaking down and understanding your scope, when things are going to happen, the schedule, and who might be doing it. And then lastly, there is some success metrics, or when you remember that quality in the middle of the triangle, how do we know that it has been done to a certain level of expectation? And it's important to note that project planning itself is an inherently uncertain process. Murphy, like we say, is a part of every project. So things are undoubtedly going to go wrong or different than you expected, and often at a time when it's least convenient. So it's important to account for the uncertainty part of the process. When you're scheduling and putting your resources together, it's really an art of balancing when resources are available, how you're using them, and how long it takes to get the work done. But once you get through this and you walk through the whole process that we're going to outline, you end up with a schedule that you can refer to really as your baseline that you'll manage change against throughout the life of the project. So your baseline planning process is a really a scripted process that follows a kind of a set of kind of defined steps. And the first part is really to identify all the work that's required, the scope and the work breakdown structure, which we're going to go through. Once you understand what needs to be done, then you kind of identify when to do it and how to get it done, which is identify a list of activities. We're going to walk through that. And then what's the relationship between those activities? And then finally, once you have those relationships built, you turn that into that baseline schedule I just described, using those relationships. And then finally, how do we apply the resources to that? So those are the basic building block steps. And now we'll kind of go into what it takes to break down that scope that we've been talking about. So you might ask, what is scope? Project scope is really that list of really specific deliverables, tangible items, features, functions that you can apply cost to. So there's often some confusion around putting activities in there and tasks, and really the scope is actually the outcome of that. So for instance, if you had a meeting, the meeting would not be the scope deliverable. The outcome of the meeting, if you came up with a marketing plan or a schedule item or something, that would be the deliverable, or that would be the part of the scope. In other words, really talking about what needs to be achieved, what needs to be done, the work that's accomplished in pursuit of the objective of the project. And at the end of the day, managing your scope helps you kind of make sure that what the stakeholders asking to be done, what they're licensing you to do, is actually accomplished, and you do it in a relatively structured and anticipated way. At the end of the day, scope management is really about making sure that you get all the work done that is expected to really achieve the project objective, and not to really do a lot of extra work or unnecessary things that are not needed. So it's about being effective. And what in the world is a deliverable? So once again, like I said, a deliverable is a tangible good, a tangible item that stakeholders can check off and say, okay, that thing is done. It's usually assigned to a person to be done, or a group of people. It generally has a due date when it needs to be accomplished. It could be a software product. It could be a physical product. It could be a report. Could be a document. Could be a service being provided. Could be a training program, marketing plan, anything like that, right? It's often confused with a milestone in a project, where a milestone is more a measure that you've made progress along the way, versus a deliverable, something that your stakeholder is asking to have produced. Now I'm going to begin to walk through the process of breaking down the scope. How do we break it down? The term in the project management world would be a work breakdown structure, WBS. You may have heard that used in the past. You may have done it yourself. Really, the work breakdown structure really helps you, the organization, and your team really understand and organize the work that you want to accomplish, It helps you kind of understand what resources you might need and what they might be doing, and helps you understand kind of where you're at along the way and some of the specifics, what the quality is, how do people receive that. And there's there's probably a number of ways to kind of come up with this, but I thought for the sake of this conversation, there's a couple that are most commonly used or often used. One is find a project that's similar or has some parts of it that are similar to the body of work you're using, and you can use that as a template, use that as an example, and it helps save a lot of time and energy in putting this stuff together, right? The other is if you need to come up with a project plan for something that you've not done before, or there's not an example to use from the past, you can get your project team, get friends, get people that have some experts, people that have some understanding of the body of work that needs to be done, and begin to brainstorm the process of breaking down those deliverables using sticky notes and walking through that. In the next slide, I'll describe that process in a little more detail. So if you're breaking it down from scratch, really follow the rules of brainstorming to get this done. Sit down and just kind of start walking through levels of detail. What are deliverables that you would develop? You know, in this case, there's no bad ideas. Don't worry about grammar. Don't worry about, is it really correct? Just brainstorm and get things on the board. When you get the list of things on the board, then begin to organize them in categories and eliminate duplicates to kind of get them in order. And what you will end up with at the end of that process, in the work breakdown structure process, is a level 1 category, which is the name of your project itself. And then your level 2 categories, which are the first level of breakdown of that work. And you might begin identifying the next level of breakdown, your level 3 categories, and so on and so forth, until you get down to, you know, metaphorically breaking the elephant down into bite-sized chunks. The lowest level of components in the work breakdown are what's called a work package. And I like to think about the work packages as those pieces of scope that I can assign to a particular person or a particular group, and they can be completed in a reasonable length of time relative to the size of your project. So if your project is 3 months, then it might be a day or a week. If your project is 2 years, it might be a week or a month, and so on and so forth. So I have an example of a project and a breakdown to make this a little more clear. So let's say you're going to build a deck, maybe one of these 2 decks, maybe something a little bit different. And this might be what your work breakdown detail looks like, where the new deck project at the top is a level 1 detail. The requirements, materials, construction, regulation are the level 2. If we go to materials and you see framing, deck, electric lighting, those would be level 3. Under framing, if you look at boards, fasteners, structural, things like that, those would be level 4. And then, you know, if you wanted to break your boards out into kinds of boards, I got long ones, short ones, you know, wide ones, fat ones, you know, that could be another level of detail. You can keep breaking this down until you get it to the pieces that you need to have delivered. The one thing you will notice about this scope breakdown is that there's no relationship between the scope here to say this thing has to be done before the other thing. There's no schedule in this. It's just a laundry list of items. It'd be like pulling together a grocery list if you're getting ready to go shopping or something like that. You're just going to have vegetables and canned goods and some other stuff over around the potato chips or coffee or something like that, but you don't necessarily have what order you're going to get it in the grocery store. So this is just a list of items, and going through this helps you make sure that you have everything that you're supposed to have done. Some common challenges, pitfalls in doing scope is sometimes taking the work package to too great of a level of detail. So it becomes too much to manage, or if you take it down to I need these things done each hour, it becomes not really manageable. You begin to use activities and tasks, not deliverables. So now you're managing the schedule, really, not your deliverables. And then, like I said before, the work breakdown is not a plan or schedule, so don't worry about sequencing these items. These are just a basic list, an inventory. What I like to call it is the inventory of work that needs to be done. So now we're going to turn this a work breakdown. So now we know what needs to be done. Now we're going to turn it into a schedule. How do we organize the schedule and get this stuff done? So converting a work breakdown to a project schedule. This is probably the activity that if you've done project management or have seen people doing it, this is the part of the process that might look most familiar, kind of creating a sequence schedule or things like that. And often, this is where you'd use a piece of software, and, historically Microsoft Project was a big tool to help do this. Now there's a number of other competing products that do a very adequate job out there to kind of, handle collaboration, organizing your tasks, and keeping status of things. One thing I will say is that getting into this step as a basis, much like a foundation for a strong deck in this case, the WBS, the work breakdown structure, really builds that foundation of the scope of work that needs to be done, that helps inform the activities required to build an effective schedule, and tries to make sure you're doing the right work when it needs to be done. So we have the steps we're going to cover. Two main steps to kind of putting this together. One is defining the activities, and the next is sequencing the activities. And we'll do those in that order. Okay. So when you define your activities, this is literally, kind of in the zone of the way we came up with the inventory of work. This is really, you can use a past project. You can bring your team back together to help brainstorm ideas again about how to get this work done. You might ask somebody that has a lot of expertise in the space to help think about how this work can be produced. And in the case of our deck project, I created, general categories of work. I need to plan and design the deck. You'll see it off to the right over here. And then I'll prepare the space for the deck, getting things ordered, clearing the area, and then we'll actually build the deck. So, putting the framing, decking, so on and so forth. And then we need to get it improved, potentially, does it have to have a structural inspection, electrical inspection? And then lastly, we get to enjoy the deck, invite people for a party and kind of celebrate, things like that. So kind of a different structure of things than what the work breakdown was, but it helps deliver all the items that we had identified on the work breakdown, right? So we're going to use those. It is common when you're doing this to know more about the beginning of the project than the end of the project, and you learn along the way. So building placeholders of activities or knowing that you're going to fill it in later is not uncommon. So the next step really is scheduling, sequencing your activities. And there's a prescribed set of relationships between the activities that are used. The four primary activity dependencies are a finish to start relationship, a start to start relationship, finish to finish, and finish and start to finish. The finish to start is the most common one. That's when task A finishes, then task B can begin. So the most common one used and the one that's most intuitive that most people think of. But you also can use a start to start or a finish to finish, where activities, once one activity begins, the other activity can start. They may have different durations. The same thing is finish to finish. When one task finishes, the other task can also be done, but they may have started at a different time. And then the last one, start to finish, and it's unlikely you would use this one very often, but it is a relationship out there that says one activity cannot finish until another activity starts. I've used it in a few rare situations, but not often. And then to each one of these 4 activity dependencies, you can use an additional characteristic, which is lead time or lag time, to more correctly reflect the relationship. And lead time is very simply an overlap. So for instance, on a finish to start, if task B can start 1 week before task A finishes, that would be lead time, a lead time of 1 week. Complementary, if the lag time would be, there would be a delay. Perfect example of this is if you paint a room, you might need to wait 12 hours before you can apply the second coat of paint. So it's a lag time. It doesn't have any work. It's just waiting. So that's kind of how you build the relationships. You go through each one of your activities, understand, does it have an activity that's a predecessor, and what does that relationship look like? And when you apply those, it helps you build a schedule that is informed based on the relationship between the activities. What needs to happen first, what needs to happen next, what can happen at the same time, and what can finish at the same time. So if we're to take those relationships, apply them to the activities that I had outlined for building the deck, it might look something like this. So in this case, step 1, we've defined the activities, groups of activities required to complete the work. The second step, we've estimated the duration that each one of those activities would take. The third step then is we've outlined some relationships that drive either the start or finish of the activities based on other work out there. And then lastly, we let the start and finish dates be determined by the relationships and the duration. So that's kind of if you follow that 4-step process on, putting your schedule together, and just kind of repeat that iteratively, it makes it a lot easier to manage over a long period of time. And then lastly, you see down there at the bottom, I have an example of a finish to start with a lag. So that says we can't really enjoy the party until the deck is complete. And we're going to wait 1 week after it's complete before we start, putting invites out for the party. And in the next slide, I have a few more examples of breaking out the plan and design piece in more detail to show an example of a milestone up there, which in software is often reflected with a diamond, has a 0 duration, and it just says, you can tell deck plan complete. That's not a deliverable, that's a milestone, and it's a way to communicate to stakeholders that you've made that level of progress. You'll see a start-to-start relationship with lag time there. So it's the attend the outdoor show to kind of select a contractor can start at the same time as you're reviewing, deck styles out there. So you're going to review those at the trade show likely. You see a finish-to-finish relationship that you can finalize your materials as you finish up revising the plan with the contractor. And you have a start-to-start relationship that says I can start finalizing the schedule as I begin revising the plan with the contractor. So an example of the different relationships and some lag time out there as well. So as we get into the final phase of this, and we have an educated scope of work, so we know what we're going to try to get done. We have an informed schedule, so we know when we want to try to do that. Now we're going to go through the final and less engineered part of the process of trying to understand how to resource the plan. So resourcing a plan really includes, resources themselves include the people, materials you might need, equipment, knowledge, time. And for the most part, and for the example I'm going to walk through, I'm dealing primarily with people and a little bit maybe with equipment. And since organizations don't generally have limited resources, you often will have to make trade-offs between the perfect resource and a resource that's good enough, and when they're needed versus when you need to have the work done. So that's really the challenge of balancing this part of the equation. And as I mentioned before, there's unknowns you have out there, and things happen differently than you expect. So all the resources you need are rarely ever available exactly when you need them. What happens in this case is that you can expect, once you get your project schedule done based on the relationship between activities, once you add people to it, it is more likely than not that it will move the final due date out, because it's an additional constraint on your schedule of work. And then at the bottom here, I'm saying that it's when you're building out your schedule and assigning your resources, you don't necessarily have to have all your resource assignments to a granular level at the beginning of your project. It's better to have the resources at a more specific level assigned for the work earlier in the project, and you may have placeholders for resources later in the project that you continue to manage throughout the life of the project, and solidify those detailed assignments as you understand the work better along the way. So that's generally the process of going through this step. Okay. So once again, like the other two processes of building out scope and building out your schedule, this also has a fairly systematic process of going through to do. So information that's good to have before you get started, makes the process run a little more effectively, is understand what roles you kind of need on the project. Do you need, programmers? Do you need builders? Do you need people with engineering expertise? So on and so forth. And then what are you going to have them do? Roughly, what are the bodies of work, or what things do you think that they're going to need to do? Which you should have some information from your activity schedule, or your scope as well. And then the number of people that you might need to get the work done. So you might know that either from your WBS or your activity schedule as well. You should have at least a rough idea. And then what equipment might they need? Do they need a special computer? Do they need a laptop? In the case of building projects, do they need particular saws or tables or a shed or something like that? And then job locations or facilities. For a number of projects that I run, you're going to need to have meeting rooms available, which seem to be at a premium often. Is there a particular facility or place like that you need? What's required? So knowing that they have a place to actually get the work done is also important. Do they need a desk or a phone or things like that? So when you develop your resource plan, another simple, kind of stepwise process. In this case, it's a 4-step process to walk through. And like the other processes, it can be kind of running through it circularly a number of times. One pass through might not be enough. And the process is really creating your list of resources, estimating the amount of time that you might need them through the project, kind of constructing or integrating their availability into your project schedule, and then negotiating or getting the resources. So the first step really is just listing out the resources you need. And this may be particular names of people, as in this case we have Sally and Bob. They own the house, they want to build the deck. It may be types of people. So in this case you need some contractors out there, and you need one of the contractors, probably general manager, to do the estimating. You don't need a lot of his time. The project manager, somebody to help do some designing, electrician, carpenters, so on. And you're going to need an inspector at some point, and you probably need to kind of get some of your buddies in to help you, if that can happen. In my case, I probably have to have some resources of beer or something to help my buddies come over and help me with the deck. So you identify the roles that those people may fill. In this case, we have designer, electrician, carpenters, general help, the inspector. What equipment is needed if necessary. In this case, I'm going to presume the contractors are going to bring their equipment, and then we would fill in with what's needed. How many resources do you need? So we've listed them out here, and then how many hours are going to be needed from the team. You know, in this case, we're not covering estimating in this particular presentation, but there's certain estimating methods you can walk through to understand how many hours you might need. In this case of a rough cut, I said if it takes a 10 or 12 weeks, or might take 3 months, you say I need so many hours per week, per month, and that would be roughly the amount of time I need, or I need people half-time or full-time, is a way to get through that. So, and then lastly, what equipment do you need, and any special software tools or things like that. Step 3 and 4, constructing a resource schedule using the information you've collected, as well as your activity schedule that you built earlier, really identifying the resources, when you would use them on the project, time frames. And this is going to be kind of an iterative process. You'll apply it, figure out what doesn't work, adjust your schedule, go through and do it again. This takes a number of passes to get this thing right. And then lastly, negotiating where and how you're going to get your resources. And that often, causes you, that negotiation will cause you to go back through these steps again until you kind of get this thing all flushed out. So the next slide is an example of what that might look like. So as we go through this, if we had this a rough schedule, you see across the top, I have a really rough idea of the deck project. I have a few weeks, about 7 weeks there, of doing plan and design, maybe selecting my contractor, doing those kinds of things. And you'll see below, I've reflected that in, how many hours per week I might need the resource. Bob and Sally need them, quite a bit of time getting that planning stuff done, less time through the preparation and construction. The contractors, you get a little of their time at the beginning on the planning, and then they begin to kind of get involved much more heavily during the building. You have your buddies come in and help you get things prepped up, maybe invite them to the party at the end, right? So just an example of how to allocate those hours. And then you can see in that column to the right, I have a column that has my estimated hours, what I thought people would use. These are the actual total hours based on the plan, a little bit different. And then your actual hours when people get through this project are very likely to be different than this happens here, because plans never survive contact with the real work. So now that is the kind of the culmination of the material I had to present. I realized that this was a little bit of a fast pass through all these steps. Obviously, I can spend quite a bit of time going into the details and nuance of building out any one of these tools, and I will open up time at this point to really respond to questions that you have about the presentation.
Great, thanks, Steve. I'll take over from here and invite people to enter questions into the chat window. We have a few already, which I'll get to in a second. I wanted to make sure to reiterate the fact that we will send the slides and the recording out about 48 hours after the session. You'll get that in an email, and we have your email with your registration. So we'll be sure to do that. You're welcome to share that amongst your team and share this awesome content with them. Okay, so a couple questions. I'll start with one that I think would be valuable to a lot of people. For managing projects, Steve, what software do you like to use for managing projects? It looked like some of those tables you had were Excel based. Are there really good project management softwares that you recommend to people, maybe starting from like the very basics and inexpensive all the way to really sophisticated and maybe high cost tools?
Yep, good question. So one tool I've had a lot of success with, especially with projects that are small to moderate size, is a project tool called a Smart Sheets. And if you've used Excel, the learning curve is very easy. Even if you use Microsoft Project, like I have for a lot of years, it just becomes a very easy tool adoption in terms of sharing it with the rest of the organization, and the price point's not too bad. All the way up, I've used some tools called like Teamwork, Wrike. Jira is a good tool for software development. And then, Microsoft Project obviously is a classic at the, at really large, much larger enterprise complex projects where you need, robust functionality out there. So, and there's a number of tools out there. There's a Liquid Planner. I've not used that one, but it's fairly prevalent. But Smart Sheets is the one I've had the best luck with in terms of just adoption and ease of use and applicability.
So for somebody evaluating software, what's the best way to go about that to make sure it's a good fit for their organization and their project?
Most tools today have at least a 30-day free license use. So I would open it up, try to enter like a simple, set of project tools, try to do some basic functions, collaborate with each other, build out like what you would expect to be a representative project piece of work in it. And if you can do it and make it manage well, then that's a good use. Also, obviously investigate the pricing and whether it has a pricing structure that works for you. And then lastly, does it fit inside the technology guidelines of your organization?
Mm-hmm.
That's important as well.
We had another question from a person that was basically in follow-up to that first question. So similar to project planning, how about software suggestions for managing multiple client projects? So not just one, but multiple that have end results.
Well, I myself use Teamwork for some of that, but I don't use Teamwork for the detailed project task planning. I use it more for high-level project delivery work. So that's one you can use. That's a little bit more of a portfolio question, or a little bit outside. I don't have a quick answer.
Okay. No problem. What's a common hang up during the project management process during the resource planning phase? So if somebody gets kind of stuck during that part of the phase, what is that for most organizations?
Probably the biggest, there's a couple of challenges in resource planning. One of them is conflicting priorities. So resources often, report to a functional manager, and you're really trying to, get their attention without direct, accountability or direct power over their time. So that becomes a challenge, is prioritizing the work you need done on your project and getting them to allocate that there. The other is really organizations often don't have very good kind of reporting or understanding of people's current workload. So it's those are probably the two bigger challenges, is the actual workload people have, and then be able to prioritize the work that you need to have done on your project.
Towards the end of the presentation, you had some tables up with some time allocations by person. How do you come up with those figures? I know they're estimates, but how do you appropriately allocate time by person that you're going to use on the project?
Well, there's a few different ways to estimate, and this is kind of getting into the estimating steps. One is if the body of work can be broken down, let's just say mathematically, like they're doing a certain number of things, and you can kind of set time to that particular thing, then you can multiply it and say, okay, they're doing that 100 of those, and it takes half an hour a piece. Like if I'm grading papers for a class or something, it takes me 10 minutes per paper. I can say I'm going to do 50 papers. It's going to take me whatever the multiple of that is. So I can estimate it that way. A lot of times, that piece of work, it's similar to another piece of work you've done. So I go, I'm going to estimate it. I'm going to need half of their time that week because I know that work's going to take about, half of a person to do. And sometimes you might just ask a person if they've done this before, if they look at this piece of work, how long do they think that it would take them to do? So those are 3 different ways to kind of get to that number. All of them are probably a wrong answer, but they're a good guess.
Okay, so we're going to take a step back a little bit. One of the questions we had was about assigning a project manager. So if your organization, you have this big undertaking of a project, how do you make sure you assign the appropriate person to lead that project? And I know that may be sort of outside of this presentation necessarily, but have you run across something like that where you might have a couple people where you end up assigning one specific person to manage the project?
Yep. So the first off is even like the project team members, what project manager is available. So availability of project managers is important. And whether the start of the project is more important than the availability, so you kind of balance those 2 things out there. You tend to want a project manager that has, they don't have to be an expert in the space, but they should have some context. They should understand the body of work. So if they're putting in a piece of software, they should have worked on a project that has some, maybe another software configuration. Doesn't have to be that software necessarily. If they're doing if they're building a bridge, they should be a construction project manager, and so on and so forth. So having some experience with the body of work. And then lastly, I would say if the project manager has some experience with the organization or that part of the organization where the project's going to happen, that helps because they would understand, have a better understanding of how decisions are made, have an understanding of the nuance inside the organization, the impact of the project on the organization, and be able to anticipate that a little bit better. So those are different things to look for in who might be the best suited project manager for a project.
So with a project that has a specific deadline, there's multiple people involved. So a bunch of individual contributors that have agreed on a deadline, but they have individual pieces to this. How do you monitor the progress? And it probably has something to do with the software, but how do you, as a project manager or as team members, monitor each other's progress and making sure that you're each hitting those deadlines that you agreed on?
There's a few different ways. So you tend to be running a status meeting with your team on a periodic basis, weekly if not more frequently, depends on the method. And during those sessions, for me anyway, I would tend to ask most of the team members to report what do they have on their plate. Are they going to get it done? If they feel like there's a risk to that, what help do they need? Can we assign that help to keep them on track? So that's one way, is really staying diligently managing the progress of things. The other is if you have the tasks out there and you ask them if they're, kind of report on their status of things, if things are running behind in your schedule, you're watching a feeding activity. If it's running a week behind and there's a dependent activity out there, then you already know that dependent activity is going to start late, right? Which is the advantage of having the linked activities out there, is it gives you a little bit of a precursor to what's coming down the road. So that question's a little more around status reporting and managing the project after the fact, but that's kind of the short answer to that.
So this is actually a follow-up a question from the same person, which I really like this question. It really gets into driving to the completion. But how do you start applying pressure when maybe somebody's underestimated their piece of the project and they're likely not to hit the deadline? How do you sort of get around that where you may have kind of you know undershot where you should be at any given time?
Uh-huh. Yep, yep. Um, that never happens to me in my projects. But what I tend to do is as early as I can, I try to hold people accountable or ask them if they're going to make the date on their body of work. And if they say yes, I'll still ask them, like, what would keep you from making that date? What would like what's the biggest risk? And try to address those things along the way. And then as we get close, if it looks like they're not going to make it, you begin to ask them, like, what help do you need to make that in time? And you really get the people involved that can maybe help get, because it might be they're waiting on an answer from somebody. It might be that another person's not getting something done that they need to get done. It might be they don't have the skills to finish everything up. It might be often it's a conflicting priority, right? So if you can go meet with their boss or something, can we get that thing off of your schedule? Because if none of those things do work and it's going to push your schedule out, now it's time to go have a conversation with your stakeholders or your sponsor and say, you know what, we're running late now because of this problem, and we need to now address that in the schedule. We need to adjust the schedule accordingly. So that's where you get into kind of the integrated change management and management of the reality of your schedule along the time.
Excellent. So we're out of questions with the exception of one. So I'll invite people to keep asking questions. They're great. Keep them coming. You may not be able to necessarily answer this. This maybe have to be a follow-up, but I thought I'd ask it anyways. So we have a lot of HR folks and managers within this webinar right now. That's typically the audience for us. So is there an example that you could provide from a project management standpoint that has to do with HR, something they may experience, and then just maybe generically break down what a scope would look like for somebody in HR?
Oh, like what an HR project would be,
Yeah,
or?
yeah. Like, how do you like if you're, let's say you're going to build an employee handbook, for example. That's a very typical HR project that you'd take on.
Well,
Could you
it's
outline
interesting you ask me. I'm currently in the middle of implementing an HR system,
that? Mm-hmm.
a new HR system for a client, and so there's a part of our process where we needed to walk through the complete steps from recruit to new hire to termination, and we had to map that whole piece out. And that was, kind of a little mini effort inside of our project to meet with every individual along the way and say, what do you do? And kind of map that whole process out. So what we did once we got that mapped out is then we looked for what are the particular, pain points along the way. What would you like to change? What causes delays? What causes, imperfect information? And then pulled those pieces out and said, those are the things we're going to try to address and prioritize those things in in an improvement part of the project. So that was an example of one thing inside of HR that we have done. The other, I was going to say, there's another number of just, operational things that we've addressed, how to switch and integrate with different like benefit providers, how to integrate more tightly with payroll, are all HR type projects we've done.
Excellent. So I think a couple people want to know as we close this up, when is the party for the deck building? I think we're gonna have some beers and help you build the deck. When are we doing that?
Well, I'll tell you, given the weather we have here, it's
Yeah.
Oregon's all geared up for a deck party weather
Hey,
now, isn't
I'll leave the office now. Let's go build that deck.
it?
Yeah.
So I also ask for the group if they can, post to Brandon, you know, one idea or one thing that you really liked about this presentation. You think it was really made it valuable, and give me some ideas of what, if you could add something to it or change something about it, what would that be, right? So if there was something in there that we could have added or augmented, what would that be as well? So you can put that in a comment to Brandon, and he'll get that to me.
Yes, very much appreciate it. Steve, thanks so much for doing the presentation for us. I know I'm better for it, and I know the audience is definitely better for it. As Steve mentioned, if you have any follow-up questions, Steve, if you wouldn't mind flipping maybe to that last page, there's some contact information. Email us, reach out through our website, consume some of our content, reach out to us anytime, and we'd love to know what you want to learn. And if you have any questions for Steve, I'll make sure to get it over to him. So thank you so much for being part of the webinar. Steve, any parting thoughts that you have?
Oh, I see. You get it out here. There we go.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
The only thing I would have is thank you all for your time this morning. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you were able to use, get one thing or a couple of things you'd add to your tricks and techniques you use. And if you have any questions about, the stuff that I covered, please let me know. I'd be happy to explain things a little more detail as needed.
Fantastic. Steve, thanks so much, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Hopefully, we'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you.